Whenever someone talks about the miscarriage of justice in Britain, the first thing that comes to mind is the Guildford bombings. The infamous incident would go down in history as the most publicized miscarriages of justice in the British justice system, and it would tarnish the system for a very long time. The incident started on Saturday night, October 5th, 1974. 2 bombs exploded in 2 separate pubs in the town of Guildford. The first pub to have a bomb go off was the Horse and Groom pub on North Street at 8:50 p.m. 35 minutes later, a second bomb went off at the Seven Stars pub off of Swan Lane. The death toll would later amount to 5 dead and 65 others injured. The only reason for the death toll not being higher was due to the owner of the Seven Stars pub. When he saw what had happened at the Horse and Groom, he quickly evacuated his pub, saving 200 people from certain injury. Police believed the reason the pubs were targeted was because of the town's high army presence. Soldiers would get paid and they'd go to the bars on Saturday night. The first bar would be the Horse and Groom. They had the cheapest beer. Then they would end the night at the Seven Stars for a bunch of rowdy dancing. This is why they believe there was a delay in the explosions. The bomber wanted to inflict as much pain as possible and raise the death count as quickly as possible. The hunt for the bomber began and the police honed in on the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, which was a terrorist group who used bombs, murder, and kidnapping as a means of spreading their message. They were set on chasing England out of Northern Ireland and killing as many British soldiers as possible to spread their message. The police were unable to find the bombers, and bombs were being planted in the months to follow by the IRA. The Parliament then passed the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which allowed the police to detain any suspects related to terrorism for 7 days. So basically, the law turned into find an Irishman, torture him for 7 days, and hope he confesses. On November 28th, the police arrested Paul Hill, the first Irishman to be arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Police reports stated that they asked him a few questions and he opened up, telling them everything. But we know this is most likely not the case, and Paul has a very different story than the police on how his confession was obtained. He recounts endless beatings, food and drink being spit on and peed on, and threats of death made against his family for endless hours. 24 hours later, Hill listed the names of people he knew, and on November 30th, Gary Cullen, Patrick Armstrong, priests, and Conlon's relatives were all to be arrested. Armstrong, right here, had been popping pills for 3 days prior to his arrest, so his confession was not very hard to get. They did the same tactics they had done to Hill and forced confessions out of Conlon and Armstrong. Armstrong would then take Carol Richardson as the fourth, named Carol Richardson as the fourth accomplice. Conlon's aunt, Annie McGuire, was named as well, and would lead to several other 7 members of the McGuire family to be placed under arrest. When the 7 days was over for the 4, they were allowed to see their lawyers, and they quickly recanted their statements. The whole time they were waiting for the trial, the bombings were still going on, and there was absolutely no physical evidence that linking the 4 to the bombings or the IRA. When the judge read the verdict at their hearing, he said he wishes Britain still carried the capital punishment because he would love to see them all hanged. The IRA started to break down while the Guildford Four were in custody. The police had found their safe house with the bombs, similar to the ones used in the Guildford pubs, and weapons and materials that were used in other incidents around England. The leader, Brendan Dowd, had been arrested and his fingerprints matched the ones at the safe house. When Joseph O'Connell, Dowd's replacement for the IRA, was questioned, he said that him and Dowd carried out the Guildford bombings. They released details that were only known by the police and were never released to the public. When they were convicted, the court dropped the charges that were related to the Guildford bombings, and the IRA leaders refused to plead guilty to the 100 other crimes because innocent men were doing time for the crimes that they committed. And they said there was no way the Guildford Four did it because they had been locked up. The IRA members were found guilty, and the Guildford Four attempted to appeal their own convictions. The retrial was not allowed to be heard by a jury, and the judges refused to grant their appeal. It wouldn't be until later in 1989 that the Surrey Police Department, who had tried them, who had obtained the interrogation, discovered to have fabricated Armstrong's confession. The idea then emerged that the police had been able to fabricate one of the confessions, then the four convictions must be overruled, since the only evidence against them was confessions. There was absolutely no physical, no fingerprints, nothing of the sort that linked them to the IRA or to the bombings. The Guildford Four were released 15 years later, and the police involved have all resigned. Some have even been charged with fabrication and corruption in later cases. The case is a prime example of why the interrogation process is just a fragile process. And if it's done wrong, it leads to false confessions. It also shows that the interrogation is the only good if physical evidence is there to back it up. Without the physical evidence, it's just worthless if the practices weren't done correctly. Because even with the evidence in front of them proving that the four could not have done it, they resort to the old way of thinking where if someone was innocent, they wouldn't confess to a crime they didn't commit. But these individuals were beaten, threatened, degraded into a confession for many, many hours with no hope of freedom because they were allowed to be kept for 7 whole days. We have to make sure that something like this never happens again by training detectives and investigators in ways to obtain true confessions. There is also a thin line that can be crossed, and if a confession is true or a means to get pressure off one's back, the detectives cannot cross that line if we are able to keep the integrity of the justice system. Thank you.